All right, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 20, and welcome to our second lecture examining the World War II era. In our first lecture, we examined the beginnings of World War II, both in Asia and Europe. We described how the United States becomes involved in the conflict and the consequences for that, as America will now once again be committed to being an interventionist power. And we concluded with that idea of the four freedoms, which is also important in regards to the way in which after World War II, America will attempt to influence a global culture in line with what is imagined to be an American notion of freedom. Here in this lecture, we'll pick up the story. We will continue our study of the war itself and then talk about how the war ends and give some indication about what the post-World War II order will look like. So buckle up, here we go with our second look here at the World War II era. As I mentioned in our first lecture, early in the conflict, beginning with Japan's invasion of China in 1937, Japan would establish an empire in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, and the parts of China it would occupy, and island Southeast Asia. At the same time, Japanese planes are bombing Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on one side of the Pacific. Japanese troops were attacking and invading the Philippines, and that led to one of the wartime atrocities of World War II, the Bataan Death March, which we talked about. So Japan was very successful. The areas you see here shaded are indicative of the Japanese gains in Southeast Asia, both on the continent and across island Southeast Asia. They were particularly keen on attacking and occupying what was then known as the Dutch East Indies, which is now the independent nation of Indonesia, because Indonesia does have rich oil reserves, and recall, Japan is completely dependent on foreign oil. And so grabbing the Dutch East Indies, today Indonesia, was key to literally fueling Japan's war machine. So Japan was very successful in the late 30s and early 40s in creating what it stylized as an Asia for the Asians. Remember, Japan used this rhetoric of being a liberator, purging Asia of European and American colonialism. But really what Japan aspired to was to control this region of the world. However, after Pearl Harbor, the United States mobilizes, and the United States turns its attention to rolling back this empire. And in the summer of 1942, the United States was able to achieve its first major victory in the Pacific at Midway Island, which is midway between Asia and North America in the middle of the Pacific, and then build on that through a strategy known as island hopping, where the United States and its British and Australian allies would concentrate on one island at a time, seeking to roll back Japanese gains, liberate that island, and then boom, move on to the next island with a strategy of eventually attacking the Japanese homeland. So in the Pacific, the United States employed the strategy of island hopping, where they focused on one island at a time in an effort to roll back the gains that Japan had made in the late 30s and early 1940s. These were brutal battles. There would be battles that would take place for weeks over one island in the Pacific. The Battle of Guadalcanal and others are famous for the intensity, the carnage, the brutality. It's impossible for me in this very brief lecture to indicate to you how intense this fighting was. There is an historian of the war in the Pacific named John Dower, and he wrote a very influential book called War IIPartTwoRecorded. And it's again a good indication that if you want to have a successful book, have a great title, a title that summarizes the core argument in the book so people don't actually have to read the book. You have that with Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, which has now become shorthand for nationalism. And you certainly have it here with this book that I urge you to read if you are interested in the military history of the Pacific Theater, if you have the stomach for this, because War Without Mercy isn't just a great title, it's a great way of understanding the conflict in this region, which was so intense, so brutal, so bloody, far more than the European theater. And John Dower, the historian who wrote this book, who coined this phrase, war without mercy, argues in that book that the nature of the fighting in the Pacific was different than in Europe because of racism. The American forces saw the Japanese forces through the lens of American racism that for many, many decades had come to see Asians as inferior. It was that ethos of social Darwinism. And as a result, Americans fought with greater brutality and ferocity because they saw the Japanese forces as inferior. But as we learned about in our first lecture on World War II, the Japanese had this image of themselves as a superior race, superior nation, and they saw the Americans as backward, inferior, decadent. And that's why the Japanese, along with their intense militarism and nationalism, fought so intensely. In Europe, you had armies that were largely white fighting against other white armies, the Germans, the Russians, the British, the French, the Americans. You didn't have that racial antagonism that so influenced the form of fighting in the Pacific that was far more brutal, far more dehumanizing. There's that concept that we talked about in our first lecture on World War II, dehumanization of the other. And I noted that once you strip an individual of their humanity, anything's possible. And the warfare in the Pacific demonstrates again what human beings were capable of when they no longer see their antagonists, their opponents, as human. And so this fighting in this theater was particularly intense and brutal, largely because of that racism. We turn our attention to the story of the war in Europe. There was a plan by the United States to attack through North Africa. Now, the Axis powers, as they were known, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Axis powers had made gains across the Mediterranean in North Africa. The region of North Africa was largely colonized by the French, but also the British. And so with Germany at war with Great Britain and France, they launched attacks on French and British colonies in North Africa. And so the Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, and Russia formulated a plan that would liberate those occupations in North Africa. If you've ever seen the great Hollywood film Casablanca, it's all about the Nazi occupation of Morocco, Casablanca, city in Morocco, by the Nazis. And so this was North Africa. This was an area like Morocco, occupied by the Axis powers and then liberated through an action of the Allies, who land troops in North Africa, roll back the gains made by the Nazis, and then launch an attack across the Mediterranean on Italy. The Italian people, seeing this growing assault attack designed to liberate Italy from fascist control, an Italian government allied with Adolf Hitler, rose up on their own and attacked and ultimately killed in the streets Benito Mussolini, who was a fascist dictator allied with Adolf Hitler. Fascism was a growing force in certain parts of the world. Germany wasn't the only nation to see such a fascist turn. There was also a fascist dictator in Italy, in Spain. To some extent, you could describe the militaristic turn in Japanese politics as emblematic of fascism. In Italy, the Italian people, having enough of their repressive dictator, Benito Mussolini, killed him and then dragged his corpse through the streets, even before Allied forces ultimately liberated Italy. And then, for some time, there was a plan to launch an attack that would liberate Western Europe. And this was much delayed and only begins on June 6, 1944. And this is a key moment to see how the course of World War II, the way in which World War II was fought, would really set the stage for the next major conflict of the 20th century, a conflict we'll talk a lot about in lectures to come the Cold War. As soon as World War II ends, because again, the history of the 20th century is just one damn thing after another, a new conflict will begin, a 50-year rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union that we know as the Cold War, and the seeds of that conflict, not unlike the seeds of World War II, setting the seeds of World War II sown in World War I, the seeds of the Cold War were in many ways sown by the events that predated it in World War II. Note the date here. It's not until June of 1944 that a Western front, a Western attack on the gains, the occupation of the German army in Western Europe is finally staged. That meant from 1941 through 1942 through 1943 and half of 1944, the only land army squaring off, fighting against the Germans, was the Russian army. And the Russians would lose millions of people in World War II. After already enduring World War I, the Russian Revolution, now, once again, Russia would lose millions of its own people because it was the only army squaring off against the Germans. Through 42, 43, and half of 44, it is not until June of 1944 that British and American forces land on Normandy Beach in France and start to march eastward towards Berlin, establishing a Western front that would divide the German forces. Now Germany had to fight on two fronts, as it had in World War I, but that's delayed until June of 1944. And the Soviets never forget this. The Soviets never forget the fact that it took so long to put American troops in danger. They never forget that the only land army squaring off against the Germans was their own. They never forget the millions of people who died protecting not just Russia, but the world from Nazi aggression. When American troops land on Normandy Beach on June 6, 1944, the war is effectively already over because German forces in the east are already in retreat. It was the Russian army that stopped the Nazis. It was the Russian army that pushed them into retreat. It was the Russian army that discovered the first death camps of the Holocaust. The Soviets will say, after World War II, to the Americans, you guys got here late and try to take all the credit. Where the hell were you in 42? Where the hell were you in 43? What we see here is the seeds of a growing animosity between the United States and the Soviet Union that will create the Cold War, where the Soviets charge the Americans with delay, with being callous about the loss of Russian lives in an effort to protect American lives by waiting to the last possible moment to establish this Western front. So that's how, in one way, we'll talk about more, one way in which the seeds of the Cold War were sown in the events of World War II. It is not until June 6 of 1944 that a Western front is established. Soon, the American-British forces pressing into France with the help of the French resistance will liberate Paris. And the scene you see here is of American, British, French troops marching through Paris, a Paris now liberated after years of Nazi occupation and Nazi control. The tide was turning now in Europe with a pincer-like effect of Allied forces marching eastward towards Berlin from the west now, and again those long-standing successful efforts of the Russians to press against the Germans in the east, marching westward towards Berlin. So the course of World War II would deepen a U.S. Soviet animosity, setting the stage for the post-World War II conflict of the Cold War. Now, the United States and the Soviet Union were rivals since the Soviet Union was formed. As we mentioned, one of the many hidden wars in American history is the effort by the United States to roll back the Russian Revolution and side with the whites in the Russian Civil War that followed the Russian Revolution. So from the very beginning, the United States was dedicated to undermining the Soviet Union. It saw the Soviet Union as a threat. It saw the possibility of a communist revolution around the world as a threat to the American economic order centered on capitalism. So it didn't take World War II to create an animosity between the United States and the Soviet Union, but absolutely the way way in which World War II played out deepened that animosity and will really set the stage for what will be our focus in many lectures to come, the Cold War rivalry of the post-World War II order, where the two nations that emerged out of World War II more powerful, the only two nations that emerged out of World War II more powerful, the United States and the Soviet Union, will be locked in a 50-year rivalry. That comes out of World War II, where there's this anger by the Soviets about the delay in establishing a Western front, a Western campaign against the German army, the way in which for years the only land army fighting against the Germans was the Soviet army, and the way in which American aid to the Soviet Union is cut off immediately after Germany's surrenders. The United States established a program even before the U.S. entered the war known as Lend-Lease. The Lend-Lease Act was passed in 1940, well before the United States enters World War II. And the Lend-Lease Act authorized the U.S. government to send billions of dollars in aid to nations deemed in America's interests. Most of the Lend-Lease aid went to Great Britain, but some went to China in its efforts against the Japanese invasion, and some even went to the Soviet Union to help the Soviet people as they managed the invasion of their nation by the Germans when Hitler violated that non-aggression pact. Lend-Lease aid in some instances meant armaments and forms of military assistance, but quite often it was simply food assistance, medicine, bandages for, again, nations that were suffering from these invasions. When Germany surrenders, when Hitler's Third Reich, which he claimed would last 1,000 years, crumbled, American ships en route to the Soviet Union, American ships stockpiled with band-aids, medicine, food, turn around and go back home. They abruptly cut off aid to people who were starving, struggling, because America was an ally of the Soviet Union in World War II in an effort to defeat Germany. But as soon as Germany was crushed and defeated, that alliance melted away, and that long-standing animosity between the two nations instead bubbled to the surface. And this, too, angers the Soviets. You took food out of our mouths. You took food out of the mouths of the Soviet people, who, again, are responsible for defeating the German army. It is the Soviet army that defeats the Germans, not the Americans. Americans come in and certainly do a great deal to push back the Germans with that Western Front, but it was the Russian army that defeated the Germans and pushed them into retreat. And the Soviet people made a great sacrifice in doing so. The Soviets lost millions of people, 20 million citizens, 7 million soldiers. That misery continued on after the conflict, starvation, disease, the consequence of the war, and for the United States to cut off Lend-Lease aid in the form of medicine and food, again, really flared and deepened the anger, the animosity between the United States and the Soviet Union. So World War I set the stage for World War II, and World War II sets the stage for the Cold War. Now, again, you don't really need a lot to put the United States and the Soviet Union on a pathway towards rivalry and collision. They were very different nations, very different ways of establishing human society and governance, capitalism, communism. They were powerful nations. But adding to that was the way in which World War II played out, where these two nations were unsteady allies, distrustful allies. Joseph Stalin never trusted Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt never trusted Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union during World War II. But on top of that, you had the great sacrifice made by the Soviets, who were responsible for, again, absorbing this attack by the Germans, stopping them from invading their capital, pushing back, and then forcing the Germans into retreat. Great sacrifice, and millions who died. Again, this is on top of the millions who died in World War I, the many who died during the course of the Russian Revolution, and the efforts of the Bolsheviks to solidify their control over the Russian nation, Russia suffering mightily in the early 20th century. And now you have this. And the Soviets feel as if the United States purposely delayed a Western front, were callous and indifferent to the suffering of the Soviet people, who died en masse in an effort to save humanity from Nazi aggression. And then coupled with the abrupt end to Lend-Lease aid, this really did, in many ways, deepen an intense animosity between the United States and the Soviet Union. There's another key consequence here, though, too, for setting the stage for the Cold War. Not only is this deepen a rivalry, not only is this intensifying anger, outrage by the Soviets, who feel as if the United States was so callous and indifferent to Soviet lives. There's also a key factor here in the Soviets making this sacrifice. As we'll soon see in our lectures to come on the Cold War, the Soviets will always cite that as a way of justifying their actions at the end of World War II and the early Cold War period, where they will occupy Eastern Europe. They will say, we deserve a chance to establish a sphere of influence on our western border. We've been invaded by Germany twice in the first half of the 20th century, World War I and now World War II. And so, as we'll soon see, the Soviets will occupy Eastern Europe, and they'll do so based on, again, this justification that we deserve a sphere of influence, a blanket of protection on our western border after having endured these two attacks by an aggressive Germany in the first half of the 20th century. And the Soviets will also, in the Cold War, argue that their system was responsible for defeating Germany. That credit goes to the Soviet Army and their system of communism for being able to absorb this attack by the German war machine, push it back, and defeat it. As we'll soon see in the Cold War, the Soviets will say to the world, our system is superior, communism. And they will point as proof their success in defeating Germany in World War II. They will say it was communism that made that possible. When Germany invades the Soviet Union and is piercing into the Russian homeland, making gains, when it looked like, potentially, the German army may be marching through the streets of Leningrad and seize the capital of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin said, it doesn't matter. They can make some gains, but in the end, I have more factories. I have more engines. In the end, we have more supplies, more manpower. And by that he meant, I've planned for this. I've planned for an attack. I'm ready. I've got more factories. I've got more engines. They can't outlast us. And Stalin will argue that planning came from his system of governance, came from communism. So there are many, many consequences here for setting the stage to the Cold War, setting in motion this deepening of animosity, the great sacrifices the Soviets will make, the way that will justify their occupation of Eastern Europe in the post-World War II Cold War era, and their propaganda claims that World War II, the success of the Soviets, their ability to defeat the Germans, proves that their system, a system they will sell to the world in the Cold War of communism, is superior. Of course, another key event of World War II that represents this terrible trend and theme of dehumanization of the other is the Holocaust. Now, you've read or are reading the memoir of Alphonse Heck. We have talked earlier about the role of anti-Semitism in the Nazi regime and the rise of fascism in Germany. Well, terribly, all of that information that you have about the culture of Nazism led to the Holocaust, the deliberate effort to exterminate people who Nazis declared were enemies of the state, who were threats to the German nation, who are the outsiders within the other of Nazi culture. In Eastern Europe, the Nazis would establish concentration labor camps and death camps. You could see the icons here that differentiate the two. Death camps were there to exterminate the population. Concentration camps were there to force these individuals to labor. Held in the camps were Jews, various ethnic minorities, gays and lesbian sexual minorities, a group of people who, again, the Nazis declared to be inferior and threats to the German nation. These camps were discovered by Soviet armies, Soviet troops who were marching westward towards the capital of Berlin. Ultimately, more than 6 million Jews were exterminated in the Holocaust. Is part of the Nazi program to exterminate them from the earth. This was a deliberate effort to kill an entire population. This was a deliberate effort to exterminate an entire people because the Nazis declared them threats within. These are the others of the Nazi culture. The Nazis inculcated the sense of us, the German people, in contradistinction to them. Very nefarious process of inclusion, exclusion. This was, as the Nazis described it, their final solution to what they saw as the problem of Judaism, that we're just going to simply kill them all. This was a deliberate effort to exterminate an entire population of people, the Holocaust. These camps were discovered. For some time, people did not believe that this actually had happened. This was a shocking moment for humanity to realize again what human beings are capable of. But eventually the evidence, overwhelming evidence in the form of photographs, movies, exposed to the world, and we didn't have a word to describe this. We didn't have a word that could communicate this absolute depravity, as well as the deliberation behind it. This wasn't just an act of war. This wasn't just an effort of army versus army, and in the course of that, millions of people dying. This was a deliberate, systemic effort to again exterminate human beings simply because of their religion, simply because of who they were. And so we needed a new word to describe this. And the word Holocaust was coined for that need. We create a language to express the world we live in. We create a language to describe what we see and what we experience. New words are constantly formed. And in World War II, we needed a word for something that was unprecedented. This systemic, deliberate effort to exterminate an entire population of people that led to the death of, again, 6 million people who are not statistics, who are not just pixels on the screen. Every single one of them was like you and I, mother, father, son, daughter, people with dreams, aspirations, who wanted to get married, have a career, and live a life, and who were denied it, who were denied that chance, who were denied that simply because of who they were. That systemic, deliberate effort to exterminate those people, the death of 6 million people at the hands of the Nazis, we needed a term to describe that. And from that came a new word, sadly, tragically, that is now part of the human vocabulary, Holocaust. All right, let's now talk about the end of the war. As I've been stressing, the Western Front is established in June of 1944, and Allied forces begin to march eastward towards Berlin, putting pressure on the German army through that fashion and rolling back their occupation of Western Europe. The Soviet army was already pressing westward towards Berlin, and all this begins to collapse upon Adolf Hitler. He can see the writing on the wall that his Third Reich that he claimed would last 1,000 years was about to fall. And before he could be captured and tried for the various crimes against humanity that he was guilty of, he went with his newlywed bride, Eva Braun, and his beloved German Shepherd into his bunker and committed suicide. Of course, it wasn't the dog's idea. The dog had to be, of course, forcibly killed by Hitler as he put a cyanide tablet under the dog's tongue. Poor dog, right? Imagine you're Hitler's dog. What a terrible bummer. What a terrible fate that would be. You know, you're with the other dogs at the dog park and they say, who's your owner? And you go, I got Hitler, right? You know, but Hitler loved this dog and he wasn't going to leave the world without it. So he kills the dog and he and his newlywed bride, Eva Braun, kill each other. And so Hitler would avoid capture and prosecution for the many, many crimes he was guilty of. Soon after, the German government that takes over after Hitler's suicide would surrender, and in May of 1945, the European theater of the war ended with VE Day, victory in Europe. And thus, the United States could turn its attention to the Pacific in an effort to win victory against Japan. The strategy of island hopping was bearing fruit. The United States and also British and Australian forces were very successful in retaking a number of the islands that had been occupied and conquered by the Japanese army, including the Philippines, which would be liberated by first forces on the ground. It's important to note that in the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, which in many ways is the third time the Philippines has been colonized, first by the Spanish and then by the Americans and then by the Japanese. During that Japanese occupation of the Philippines, American and Filipino forces who were abandoned by Douglas MacArthur and the American officials who were in charge with defending the Philippines, they fought a guerrilla war against the Japanese occupation. And this, too, is one of the most fascinating elements of World War II. The efforts of Filipino and Americans banding together, working with brave Filipino civilians to undermine the Japanese occupation, to fight against the Japanese efforts to control the Philippines. So the American, British forces, Australian forces that landed in Leyte Gulf and helped liberate the Philippines were really aided by the efforts of people on the ground for years who had fought against the Japanese occupation. Filipino civilians, Filipino soldiers, and Americans, but Douglas MacArthur gets all the credit for honoring his vow to return. And so he and these forces liberate the Philippines. And now the last set of islands that must be attacked and controlled are the Japanese islands themselves. And in late 44, early 45, the Japanese government is also seeing the writing on the wall and realizing the war is coming to an end and their defeat is certain. And negotiations begin between the Japanese government and the United States. One of the many myths that far too many Americans harbor regarding the conflict of World War II is this idea that Japanese would refuse to surrender. They were never going to surrender. They're going to fight to their last man, fight to their death. We had to drop the bomb on them because they refused to surrender. It's nonsense. It's very easy to refute. There are reams of documents going back and forth between the Japanese government and the American government from late 1944 through 1945 regarding the terms of surrender, where the Japanese officials are confessing, acknowledging they're going to lose, and they are seeking a way to end the war. But the sticking point concerned the issue of unconditional surrender. The United States, in these reams of documents and all of these telegrams going back and forth between Tokyo and Washington, D.C., the U.S. officials and all of that process of negotiations are demanding unconditional surrender, meaning Japan surrenders without any conditions. They are completely subject to American designs, intentions as to how to end the conflict. There'll be no concessions, no conditions whatsoever. But Japan was demanding one condition, just one. And that condition was preserving the life of the emperor. They did not want to allow, in an unconditional surrender, the United States to occupy Japan and try and execute Emperor Hirohito. Now, I mentioned many times in these lectures that in the interwar period of the 20s and 30s, there's this sort of intense militaristic nationalism in Japan that, like all nationalisms, was predicated on an imagined past. And in that process, the Japanese emperor was reimagined as semi-divine, as the descendant of the original gods that created the Japanese islands. Every nation has an origin story. It's how they create national mythology, national origin stories. And in the Japanese origin story, there's the story of these gods who created these islands. And the emperor is the descendant of those gods. And in the nationalism that prevailed in the 20s and 30s, that kind of old idea was resurrected as a way of encouraging emperor worship, idol worship, love the leader in Japan in the 20s and 30s. And as a result, the Japanese officials feared that it would be too traumatizing to the Japanese people to see their emperor executed. Now, Hirohito was also culpable, responsible for many wartime atrocities. In fact, as I mentioned in our most recent lecture, he appointed the general that presided over the rape of Nanking. So there is reason to believe that Hirohito should have been tried and executed. But the Japanese didn't want that to happen because they again believed it would be too traumatizing to their population to not only be defeated in the war, but upon that defeat, see their emperor executed. And so this becomes the sticking point. This becomes the sticking point in negotiations between the United States and Japan about the end of the Pacific theater of the war. Again, it is a myth. It is blatantly untrue that Japan refused to surrender, that they refused to give up, that they were going to fight to the last man. That's a lot of, again, the misunderstanding that far too many Americans harbor regarding World War II. It's absolutely documented. The negotiations were taking place. The sticking point became this issue of unconditional surrender. The United States insisted on unconditional surrender. Japan was willing to surrender with only one condition, preserving the life of their emperor. And then, in early 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies in office. As I've mentioned, Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 32. He's reelected in 1936, 40, and 44. He presided over these two great crises of the early 20th century, the Great Depression, World War II. But in 1945, he died. And his vice president, Harry Truman, took over. Now, Roosevelt always had vice presidents who were out of the loop, who were willing to be in the background because, again, he wanted to be president, and he was willing to run and run and run for re-election accordingly. So Harry Truman, as vice president, was really out of the loop. He really didn't have much of a hand in regards to managing the war. He was so far out of the loop that he didn't even know that the United States had been working and testing the atomic bomb, had been working on the development of this new technology. FDR dies. Truman is thrust into the presidency, into office at this fateful moment when the war is coming to an end. And he's told, oh yeah, we've been working on this bomb and we're kind of anxious to see what it could do. We haven't tested it in the theater of war. And because Japan refused to surrender unconditionally, even though they were willing to surrender with just one condition, Truman would elect to drop this bomb that he only months earlier learned about on civilian populations in Japan. And that would occur on August 6, 1945, when the first atomic bomb, the first nuclear weapon in human history, was used on the civilian population of Hiroshima. Hiroshima was selected because it had not been bombed extensively prior to this. It was a city largely untouched by American bombing raids. Now, leading up to a potential invasion of the Japanese islands, for some time American planes had been flying over parts of Japan and dropping bombs and weakening the nation in preparation for a potential assault on the Japanese islands. But Hiroshima was completely untouched, and that's why it was selected. So lucky up to this point, and then tragically unlucky. The reason why it was selected was that it hadn't been bombed, and the Americans wanted to see what this bomb could actually do. And so if we dropped it on a city that had already been bombed, we wouldn't quite know, was the damage a result of previous bombing or this bomb? And so they selected a city that was more or less pristine. And on August 6, 1945, human history forever changed because this was now a nuclear age. This was now an age where with one bomb you could vaporize an entire city. On August 6, 1945, predicated again on this idea that Japan must surrender unconditionally, and because they refused to do so to preserve the life of their emperor, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And this is what the city looked like after one bomb. This is what the city looked like. A city that again was completely unscathed, untouched prior. One bomb did all of this. Humanity had now entered a nuclear age. Humanity had now entered an age where technology allowed for one bomb to do all of this damage. Now, tack back to what we said earlier in the class about World War I and how it changed attitudes about science, technology, In the early 20th century, in an age of modernization, industrialization, new technology seemed to brim with possibility for a better, maybe even perfect world. And then you had that lost utopia sensation that came with the aftermath of World War I, where submarines, airplanes, all of these instruments of science were revealed to bring death and destruction. Well, here we amplify that many fold. This is a new technology unveiled to the world in World War II, nuclear physics, that had this ability to destroy an entire population. 70,000 people die instantly when the bomb hits the ground. Some Americans were killed. This is often, again, overlooked or unknown about the bombing of Hiroshima. American POWs, soldiers who had been captured by the Japanese, were kept in Hiroshima. So they were killed along with many Japanese. One of the arguments that's often been used and still is used to justify the bombing of Hiroshima is this idea, well, it was saved American lives, because the idea is the only other choice was to launch an invasion of Japan, as if that was the only other choice. And so you often hear this to this day. Well, it saved American lives. Well, the problem with that is it also took a number of American lives, because some Americans were killed, POWs who were held in Hiroshima. There is the death that comes with the initial blast. And then there's the death that follows, as people would die of radiation burns, poisoning, starvation, all sorts of terrible effects that ravaged Hiroshima in the weeks, months, and years that followed. By the end of 1945, within a matter of months, the death toll had doubled, and many more would die in the years that follow from, again, the consequences of being subject to nuclear radiation, to being human guinea pigs in this experiment as to what this bomb could do to, again, a human population. And I hope I don't need to remind you at this point. Those are numbers on a screen. You can write them down in your notes. They're important to your understanding of World War II. But remember, every single one of those individuals was a human being, was, again, someone with a soul, subjectivity, dreams, aspirations, and all that was lost with one bomb dropped in August of 1945. 3 days later, the United States attacks another Japanese city, Nagasaki. And again, you have that same cycle of misery and death. You were better off dying in the initial blast, being vaporized, rather than surviving, because, again, you survived, but you might have your body riddled with radiation. You might have your body scarred by radiation poisoning. So the death and misery continued for weeks and years even after the ill effects of this. And again, this would be justified by the United States in an argument of saving lives, of course, American lives. It is often justified to this day by many who say we had to do this. It was the only way to get Japan to surrender. Again, the only other option was an invasion. Well, again, that's easy to deflect, because Japan was willing to surrender. It was simply that matter of unconditional surrender. And the irony or tragedy of all of this is, when Japan does surrender unconditionally, we never prosecute Hirohito. He's allowed to live. So if this was the great sticking point, if it was all about justice and holding Hirohito accountable, that never even happened. Hirohito lived for a very long time after World War II and went completely unpunished because, as I've mentioned earlier, the United States will diligently attempt to make Japan our ally after World War II in the Cold War. We wanted Japan to be close to the United States, an ally, a bulwark against communism in Asia, and so we never executed Hirohito. And yet that was the sticking point that led to this new chapter in human history. Humanity had now entered the nuclear age. Now you could see it was possible to destroy an entire city, an entire nation, and soon an entire world with just a few bombs. And ever since Hiroshima, ever since this moment, human history has been shaped in the shadow of the bomb. Here are a couple of images. Again, it's important to see these because they are so tutelary. They are so educational. These are human beings. And again, it's more than just statistics. These were human beings and were confronted by their humanity in these photographs. But I'm only confronting you with a couple. The point here isn't to use these for gratuitous reasons. If you're interested, of course, you can seek out much more. But it is important for all of us to see these and see that human consequence of what happened at the end of World War II. A new age had indeed dawned. And in many ways, this is the ultimate culmination of what we've been seeing in the course of this class. How in the 20th century, you have total war. You have war not between different armies or navies, but you have war between two nations, two societies, where the totality of that society is affected, where you can be hundreds of miles away from a battlefield. Hiroshima wasn't the scene of a battle between American and Japanese forces. It was an industrial city, populated by school children, civilians, again, ordinary human beings, and yet it became a war zone in the way that we just documented. So this is the culmination of total war. It's the culmination of the deliberate targeting of civilians. There are no battlefields in the 20th and now 21st century. Everything is subject to this aggression and these military actions. So it began with World War I as a total war, mass mobilization, targeting of civilians, now amplified in this way. And we're about to vault into the second half of the 20th century. We are at the midpoint in the class now. And so many of the key events that we will soon encounter in the second half of the 20th century are colored and influenced by the shadow of the bomb, by this looming potential that at any moment with a push of a button, all of humanity can be destroyed. The Cold War, the conflicts of the early 21st century, and the world we live in today is shaped by the events that occurred in August of 1945, where again, there's no going back. We now live in an age where it is possible to destroy all human life on the planet. And so many of the events in and around the world in the last 80 years have been deeply influenced by that reality. We are about to vault into the second half of the 20th century, and two nations emerge more powerful out of World War II. Most of the nations involved in World War II will recede in power. Germany, France, Great Britain, Japan. But two nations emerge more powerful, the United States and the Soviet Union. And for the next 50 years, these two nations will be locked in a global rivalry for global influence as to be the great influence on the world stage. It's a rivalry between communism and capitalism, democracy and one-party rule. It is also, though, a conflict that is deeply influenced by this new nuclear age, where both nations will build up arsenals of weapons that can destroy all of human life. Where at certain moments in the Cold War, we will come very close to another use of these weapons. As of now, check your news updates, your watches. As of right now, at least, these are the only instances of the use of nuclear weapons. The United States is the only nation to actually have used the bomb. But during the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis and many events, it became very almost right up to the line of a second use. So the Cold War is deeply shaped by the potential and very close potential of another nuclear strike. In 1949, the Soviet Union tests their first nuclear weapon, and it starts an arms race that leads to a massive arsenal of these weapons that are still around today and still pointed at us as we speak. There's no going back. A new nuclear age had dawned. And even though the Cold War officially is over, though I'll make a point in lectures soon that it's not over, but at least officially the Cold War ends in 1991, those weapons are still around, and they're still pointed at us, and they certainly still influence international politics. Some of the conflicts after the Cold War, like the first Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, were deeply influenced by this fear of a nuclear weapon being used. And so today, whether it's the rivalry between India and Pakistan, whether it's America's sanctions against Iran, or the effort to bring Iran into a deal that will prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, or our ongoing rivalry with the Soviet Union, China, both nations having huge stockpiles of nuclear weapons, Russia and China. So much of the world you live in today in 2021 is so influenced by a new nuclear age. Let's now talk about the process of creating a post-World War II global order. As early as 1943, the big three, the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, began meetings around the globe to imagine and create what the world may look like after the fall of Nazi Germany in a post-World War II age. The leader of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, the leader of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, and the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, all began these meetings as early as 1943. In many of those meetings in 1943, you have Joseph Stalin pressing Roosevelt and Churchill to establish a Western Front. So this was really the nucleus of those contentions between the two nations. In 1945, you had the last of these meetings where Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Stalin met at Yalta. And there, the map of Europe was created with the pending soon victory against Germany. As I've said now many, many times, the Russians absorb an attack by the Germans and then march westward towards Berlin, forcing Hitler into suicide. And what happens is that as the Soviet army sweeps through Eastern Europe, as it liberates nations like Poland that had been brutally occupied by the Germans, as the Soviets discover for the first time the death camps of the Holocaust, as they make their way through Eastern Europe, they stay there. And they stay there and occupy that region of the world for the next 50 years during the Cold War. They will establish puppet states, totalitarian states, communist states tied to Moscow for the next 50 years in places like Poland, in places like Austria and Hungary. And the Soviets argue we're justified in this because we deserve a blanket of security. We deserve a sphere of influence after being attacked twice by Germany in the first half of the 20th century, in World War I, World War II, losing millions of people, and in this conflict, World War II, protecting humanity from the scourge and threat of Nazi Germany. We defeated the Nazis, and so we deserve this blanket of security, the sphere of influence, and so the Soviets occupy Eastern Europe. Now, FDR and Churchill aren't too keen on this. They represent liberal democracies. They represent capitalist economies. They had long before World War II seen communism in the Soviet Union as a threat. But the Soviet army's there. And the only choice to remove them is to go to war with the Soviet Union. And there was no appetite and no eagerness by Great Britain or the United States to end the war against Germany and then turn around and go to war with the Soviet Union to liberate Poland. So the leaders of Great Britain and the United States reluctantly have to accept this, with now that part of Europe, Eastern Europe, under Soviet occupation. Soviets occupy it as they liberated those countries from Nazi control, and the Soviets are determined to stay there, to extend their influence into Eastern Europe, to create governments in those countries that are communist, that are allied with the Soviet Union, justified by, again, their claims to security. And so Eastern Europe at Yalta became really the province of the Soviet Union, as they will control the Baltic nations, Poland, Yugoslavia, exert their influence in Austria and Hungary. These Eastern European nations, many of which were formed at the end of World War I and then were invaded by Germany as Hitler came to power and began to unleash his war machine and attack these nations, would now be dominated and influenced by the Soviet Union. They have very tragic stories in the first half of, and second half as well, of the 20th century, because their independence is brief. It is shattered by German attack and occupation, and then they are subject to the yoke and influence and occupation of the Soviet Union. So poor Poland, poor Austria, poor Hungary, they really never had a chance at self-determination in the 20th century. Again, the United States and Great Britain fear this. They fear this ascendant Soviet state influencing that part of the world. But what can they do? The Soviet army's there. And the only option to get rid of them is to go to war with the Soviet Union, and that's not really an option. So Yalta is a key moment where Stalin makes clear that he's going to occupy this part of the world, and really FDR and Churchill have no choice but to accept that. However, as we'll talk about in our lecture soon on the Cold War, the position of the United States is the Soviet Union goes no further. They have Eastern Europe. We don't like it. We'll try to undermine it in various ways. We'll try to foment democratic revolutions in that part of the world. We'll beam the voice of America into these Eastern Bloc nations and spread propaganda. We'll try to end Soviet influence, but there's little we can do about that. However, everywhere else around the world, it's up for grabs. And the United States in the Cold War is determined to make sure the Soviet influence goes no further than Eastern Europe. Here is what I just described visually. The nations that are shaded, I don't know, something vaguely resembling blue here, in Western Europe are the nations that would be liberated by the Allied forces. So the American British forces land there on the coast of France. They march eastward towards Berlin, and in doing so they liberate these countries in Western Europe shaded roughly something approximately blue. The nations shaded red, that's easier for me to identify, are the nations that were liberated by the Soviet army. The Soviet army marches through Eastern Europe. It liberates Poland and other nations shaded red here that were occupied by the Nazis, marching westward towards Berlin, forcing the end of Hitler's Third Reich. And at the end of World War II, in May of 1945, this is what the map of Europe looks like, with a divided continent, with the western part of the continent liberated by the British and American forces, and the eastern part of the continent liberated by the Soviets. And the Soviets stay in all these countries. These are the nations that form the Eastern Bloc. These are the nations that form the Warsaw Pact. These are the nations that are allied with the Soviet Union for the next 50 years. Those nations shaded red. And the nations shaded blue here in the West, France and Great Britain and others, are going to be allied with the United States. And they're going to have democratic governments. They're going to have socialist economies, capitalist economies, mixed economies, but ultimately economies that recognize private property and free enterprise. The nations shaded red here are going to have communist-ruled governments, one-party rule, bureaucratic rule, and communist economies. And so the way World War II plays out sets the stage for the Cold War. The way in which World War II ends creates the new conflict of the Cold War. Communists versus capitalists, democratic versus totalitarian, West versus East. So the story of World War II, the effort to occupy, liberate the continent from Nazi control, really creates the literal terrain and geography of a divided continent in the Cold War, and in many ways a divided world. The end of World War II would mark a great shift in terms of global power. The two nations that emerged more powerful, the United States and the Soviet Union, and with it came the decline of Great Britain, France, Germany, nations that in the late 19th and early 20th century were the great global hegemons. Prior to World War II, Great Britain was still the most powerful nation on earth, not just militarily, but also financially. It had a huge empire that spanned the globe. France and Germany, also major global powers, but that would end with World War II, as those nations were weakened, decimated by now 2 world wars, and instead the United States and the Soviet Union would emerge as the great superpowers in the second half of the 20th century. So you can now see a major shift in global supremacy, with the United States emerging as the most powerful nation on earth, eclipsing Great Britain. This is symbolized by how the U.S. dollar would now be the global currency by which all other currencies are measured. Prior to World War II, that was the British pound. But after World War II, with the decline of Great Britain, now the U.S. dollar would be established as the world currency, the currency by which all others are measured, very symbolic of this now ascendance of the United States. New institutions would be formed after World War II to rebuild the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and though these nations are global in name, they were largely dominated by U.S. banks that would finance this effort to rebuild the world, and often do so in a way that was in line with American economic interests, particularly in a Cold War where America was dedicated to combating the spread of communism and preserving a global order centered on the American economic system of free market capitalism. Another good example of how things are changing in terms of the role of the United States around the world can be seen in the fact that the United Nations is created after World War II to fill the void left by the now moribund League of Nations, and the United Nations would be headquartered in the United States. This is very symbolic of how different the end of World War II is for the United States compared to the end of World War I. At the end of World War I, the United States refuses to join the League of Nations and instead embraces 20 years of isolationism. It took Pearl Harbor. It took an attack on American soil to reawaken that sleeping giant. So at the end of World War I, when a League of Nations is created, America wants nothing to do with it and instead embraces isolationism. Contrast that with the end of World War II, where at the end of World War II, not only does the United States join the United Nations, the successor to the League of Nations, it headquarters it right here in New York City. And a lot of pundits, particularly on the right, like to criticize the UN as something that compromises America's sovereignty. There's this whole tradition in conservative politics in the United States going back to the founding of the United Nations that this is a horrible idea. It's going to compromise American sovereignty. We'll all be bowing down to the UN, and you still hear a lot of that on the right to this day. The problem with that idea is the United Nations largely bows to the United States. It's largely enforcing policies friendly to American interest, and the United States has the most powerful influence on the United Nations. So rather than a tool for compromising American power, it has instead often been a tool for applying American authority around the globe. During World War II, the publisher of two very influential periodicals in America, Time magazine and Life magazine, Henry Luce, declared the 20th century the American century. Henry Luce was the publisher of Time and Life magazine. Go back with me. Doodaloo, doodaloo. There used to be these things called magazines. You can ask your parents or grandparents about them. They were printed on this stuff called paper. And you would subscribe to them. And once a week, once a month, someone would put them in your mailbox. Yeah, I know. Strange. Science fiction, right? Like a weird world that's so hard to relate to. In the 20th century, Time and Life magazines were very popular, widely read magazines that millions of Americans subscribed to. And Luce was the publisher of those very influential periodicals that you would find on the coffee tables of Middle America. And during World War II, Luce took to the pages of those magazines of great influence, and he argued the 20th century is the American century. Now, it takes some cheek, it takes some moxie to declare an entire century yours, especially when that century isn't even halfway over. Luce made this argument when the war was still continuing, when victory for the United States was uncertain, unclear. But he anticipated victory, and he anticipated America once again returning to being an interventionist power and influencing the globe, eclipsing Great Britain and France, And this new 20th century, now an American century, where the United States would influence the globe, not just financially, through our financial might, not just militarily, through our mighty military, but culturally, through Hollywood films, through American music, through American consumerism, consumer culture. Now, we indicate this because, well, Luce turned out to be 100% correct. In the second half of the 20th century, America returns to its interventionist role, and America does emerge as the most powerful nation on earth, committed, particularly during the Cold War, to global intervention and influence. So Luce was very prescient, very forward-looking when he declared the 20th century, the American century, very indicative of this great global shift, where unlike the end of World War I, where America would retreat into isolationism, America now, as we'll see for the rest of this course, as we now examine the second half of the 20th century, will be committed to being an interventionist power, marching around the globe, influencing the world in line with, again, this vision that our way is a global way, that our notion of freedom is an American notion of freedom, that everyone wants to wear Levi's, drink Coca-Cola, and live as we do. Now, as we will soon see, that's not exactly the case. Many people around the world have different visions for progress, for the good life, for how they want to organize society. It's one of the great themes of this class, is that the 20th century in many ways is a story of clashing visions of progress, clashing visions of how best to organize society. As we've indicated very clearly here, the Soviet Union is also dedicated to making the 20th century its century. It is also dedicated to influencing the globe. It will also, in various ways, culturally, militarily, politically, economically, seek to influence the globe, and they have a very different vision of how to organize society. And then there are others who don't want anything to do with either these systems, capitalism or communism. So it's one thing to have an intent, it's quite another to manifest it as reality. The United States has an intent to influence the globe, but the world has other intentions and designs, and we'll see how that plays out in our survey of the second half of the 20th century. But we can now here introduce this idea, authored by Luce, that the 20th century is the American century, by which he means the century America will emerge as a great global power. Let's now take a status report of where we are at the end of World War II in 1945, when, through the course of the war itself, a new conflict began. The animosity between the United States and the Soviet Union, the way in which the war plays out, this divided continent of Europe, with half of it under Soviet influence, the other half under American influence. The war is over, but a new conflict begins, a Cold War, one that will play out in the shadow of a new technology in the hands of human beings that allow for the absolute destruction of all life here on Earth. But there are other trends that are important to note that will also have great influence on world history in the second half of the 20th century. It's not simply a world molded and designed by these two great superpowers. With the decline of Great Britain, with the decline of France, comes the loss of their empire, and a wave of decolonization will sweep across Latin America, Africa, Asia. New nations will emerge, nations finally able to secure their own independence. Along the Cold War, another great theme of the second half of the 20th century is decolonization, and many of our lectures in the weeks ahead are dedicated to how that happens, how it plays out, how these nations that have long been denied sovereignty and independence are able to shake off the yoke of colonialism and create nations of their own, or more precisely, the extent to which they're able to do that. How far they're able to divorce themselves of the consequences and legacies of colonialism. So decolonization comes along with the decline of Europe, and decolonization is a complicated affair that we will see that speaks to the promise and hopes of independence, and then the realities of a global situation still scarred and influenced by those legacies of colonialism. As those nations emerge, they will seek to create their own identities, their own independence, and wrestle with the new industrial economy, and the challenge of modernity. Decolonization is one of the key narratives, stories of the second half of the 20th century. And with it will come challenges for these new nations as they wrestle with the legacies of colonialism, what was the residue and lingering influence of European and American interruption of their own histories, their own development, while facing the context of the Cold War and the ongoing challenges of the 20th century in regards to how to organize society and what to aspire to.